Hello again, Steve here with a few words. I'm just on a drive, and hopefully you can hear the background noise of road noise and everything, but I just had a thought came to mind as to sort of placate the anxieties, if you will, about regulations and so on that we are subjected to so often, or perception is we're subjected to them, and how to reconcile that inside our own consciousness. And what I noticed is that, like when I did that presentation, I talked about how the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is a large part of the Constitution Act 1982, does not apply to private individuals. That's the Government of Canada's own interpretation of it, Section 32. It makes sense in a way because regulations, after all, they have to do with regulations rather that a bunch of people agree to follow or are obliged to follow or whatever, result or are within public settings, right? Because obviously if one was a hermit, lived in the middle of a forest somewhere, and never came into contact with anybody, there'd be no public regulation of any kind, because there'd be no agreement to make with anybody. So therefore, you'll hear these terms, that I have anyways, if you're at all interested in the concept of freedom, this term public versus private. And, an older term for public would be the commons. What's common, right? Commonly held. This road that I'm driving on, for example, would be an example of the commons, or the public. Public comes from popular or populace. It's nobody really owns it. Everybody has access to it, and so on. But because of that, because of the public ownership, if you will, which is non-ownership in a way, or the concept of. But nevertheless, there's going to be, if not written down rules of conduct, unwritten rules of conduct. There's always going to be rules of conduct within a public setting. There has to be, otherwise nobody knows. Well, I shouldn't say nobody knows. People can run on a moral compass, for sure. But there's going to be those who don't know how, and they're going to have to be suggested to. So the only thing that comes down to then is the form of enforcement of these rules. In a voluntary society, the enforcement of rules is done through things like ostracism, of not dealing with people who won't act in a civil, dignified, and respectful way. In a non-voluntary society, you have a class of thugs, basically, who beat the regulations into people. But even in that, a more refined version of a civil society, such as we have today, in comparison to, say, Hannibal's civilization or something like that, which was, off with your head forever if you look at them wrong, kind of thing. We don't have that anymore, but we still have, the brute force of enforcement as opposed to voluntary ostracism and this sort of thing. But at least we've evolved to the point of recognizing that there's private and there's public. And what I've noticed is that anything that's really private, there's no written regulation, for one thing, and not really any unwritten regulation. And certainly there's basically a policy, for the most part, of just leave you alone. For example, the things that are regulated, the things that have these statutes and acts and rules and all that people come after you with a club to make sure you follow, are things to do with public settings. Things like traveling on public roads. Things like having a job, which is a public thing because it's working in a public organization where there's many people, right? Things like living in cities, where you have a post office address, which is a public entity of some sort, right? It's a commonly shared system of communication. Things like having a telephone, things like having a civic address, which is a system of, or a postal code. These things are, recognized within a vast bunch of people. So because of that, there's regulations to do with, and there's always going to be. Like I say, the only difference is whether it's imposed by the clubs and bullets, or just the willingness of the free market of association. Because ostracism and not dealing with people is a very strong motivation for people to behave in the way that other people want them to behave. The market works like that. For example, it's a true free market is a true free justice system. Now, so I think that, I just thought of this because, why is it that even though it's not written anywhere that we have to have driver's licenses and license plates and this sort of thing to conduct private activity on a public road? Well, I think it's because people who write these things know they have no jurisdiction over private. But the common law that exists within these, the commonsensical law that exists within these regulations seems to say that if you're going to use a road that has been built for, in theory anyways, that has been built for by everybody, and you're going to use a machine to do that travel with, then you're gonna do some damage to that road, potentially. And also you could potentially be trafficking. Trafficking, of course, means carrying something for a fee, or carrying something more than yourself, essentially, right? Whereas if I just walk down the road, so far anyways, nobody requires me to have a license. The common law, as well as the corporate law, does not require me to have a license, because it is deemed that the only thing that I could possibly be doing, within reason anyways, is private business, or private activity. I'm carrying myself and my own ass with my legs. And a bicycle is just an extension to our legs, so the same thing applies to a bicycle. But we get into a vehicle that weighs several tons and go careening down the road at 100 kilometers an hour or 80 miles an hour, and carrying, a trailer hitch and a sack of food and a bunch of this and that, junk in the back, and garbage load to the dump and all that sort of stuff. We're doing more than just carrying our prime mover around, right? So it is deemed that we're in business at that point, and therefore it seems like nobody gets away with it, except in some cases they do. If they live someplace that has a very, very strong constitution that says that it can be argued or can be pointed out that can restrict the other members of the society to say, look, agree to it or leave me alone. Agree to punish me for doing something that you haven't explicitly said that I can't do, or leave me alone. That doesn't certainly be the case here. So I would say that if we want to be left alone, we have to operate in the private. We have to submit ourselves to the public regulations, with knowledge as to why we do it, right? We don't necessarily agree with it. We might just be doing it for self-defense purposes, this sort of thing. But nevertheless, know why we're doing it. And in terms of improving the quality of our life experience, well, knowing why we do something, I think, helps us with self-knowledge, and vice versa. Having self-knowledge helps us to know why we're doing something. And living more of our life in the private side of our life, I would say, certainly simplifies things. That book by Henry David Thoreau, Walden, is a great example of somebody who thought this through to a great extent, about sometimes having less, equals out to a more private life. It doesn't mean we don't have to interact with people, but we interact with them privately rather than some sort of a public presentation. And life becomes simpler, but it can become more meaningful and certainly more enjoyable. That, to me, improves the quality of our lives. So my point being here, from what I can see, regulations that we commonly get pestered by don't seem to have any implication or application in the private life. And if they are a hassle, which they are to some people, one solution would be to just live more in the private, create a simpler life, more enjoyable life, and then to me that would improve the quality of our life experience. Once again, hope this was helpful, and appreciate sharing a few thoughts. Talk to you again soon. Bye for now.